It's a warm, calm breeze that marks the passage of a violent storm, and it's this quiet stone that marks the memory of children lost. On the noisiest New London days, it's always quiet here. This is sanctuary, from a past too painful to remember, too horrifying to forget. While this is the monument for the generations after, those of us who weren't there, this is the monument for those who were.
She was tops in spelling, you know, and she was one that's supposed to go that day to Henderson for the day, and she just didn't want to go, and I never did know why.
For many, 50 years haven't been enough to numb the pain, but for Ralph and Jewel Carr, peace came long ago. If God seemed far away when the high school erupted, he was never closer than when the dust had settled. The Carrs say their faith brought them through the death of Chloe Ann, and it's probably the same faith that's kept them together for 67 years. She's 87, he's 93. A little slower now, but 50 years later, they still visit Chloe's grave on holidays and her birthday.
After that, every year in the spring, when March came, I always was, depressed, over what had happened for a long time, for a good many years.
It's a peculiar thing when children die. If Chloe were alive today, she'd be 66. But these flowers and soft prayers remain for a bright young girl who will always be 16.
You are mine, sweetie pie.
1937 in America was not 1937 in New London, Texas. East Texas seemed to be more of an island, floating on an endless black sea, oil. While the rest of the nation hungered and choked on dust, New London swam in rivers of prosperity. Millions of barrels of Texas crude were pumped every month. Forests of oil rigs took over the landscape. The long line led not to the soup kitchens, but to the cashier's window.
It was a small town, and friendly people, and lovely people, people that you were glad to have for friends. And it was a very busy little town, though, because everybody was working for the oil companies.
Indeed, New London was a good place to be, and hopeful thousands crowded in looking for a piece of the growing pie. Within 24 months, enrollment at the schools jumped 1,000% to more than 1,100. A new school stood to take them in, a proud, sparkling tribute to the affluence of New London. This was the richest school in the world. Oil rigs were pumping on school property. It's one of the first schools in the country to have a lighted football stadium. This school, this town, these people seemed to have it all. Oil had given, but oil would take away. March 18th, 1937, a Thursday, a warm spring-like day, a lot like this day. A lot of the students were working for the county meet, which would be coming up on Friday. That and the three-day weekend were filling the school with excitement, but also filling the school, quietly, almost innocently, natural gas. It had leaked for perhaps days from loose pipes and fittings, and it had filled the area beneath the school floor, waiting, undetected. Laureen Bright and her daughter Darween Bright Hoff live here now in Roy, Utah. But that March day, they were in the New London High School gym for a PTA meeting. Darween was dancing in a Mexican hat dance. Mildred and Carol Evans now live in Henderson, Texas. He was a science teacher, just leaving for the day. She, a first grade teacher, sitting in on the meeting watching Darween dance. 10 minutes before the final bell, a spark in the shop detonated what had become a natural gas time bomb. In a fiery instant, the school exploded, all but disintegrating.
I thought it was an earthquake. Couldn't think of anything else, and I looked up, and the trees just outside the window were moving like wind had hit them.
Well, I was sitting up on the bleachers way up high, and it knocked me out.
The first time I ever saw a picture of an atomic bomb go off, that's what it reminded me of.
It would turn out those in the gym were the safest, but elsewhere, tons of concrete and steel thundered down on top of 700 children.
It was just huge mass of smoke and debris and everything just went way up like this, and then it came over and almost hovered above us, like it just came right over where we were, and then it simmered down and came back down and settled down again.
No one knew or understood what had happened, and they could barely see what remained, a crumbled, twisted mountain of rubble hidden in a thick, choking fog of dust.
But when I got to that door, the silt and the dust was so thick until I couldn't breathe it. I just was smothering. And when I got out the door, I was in a sea of voices. I couldn't see a face, but I could hear voices, but I couldn't see a soul. And so then I began to feel my way along the wall. That wall was standing.
Separated by blind panic and confusion, mother and daughter feared the worst about each other.
And I ran on to a girl laying on the ground, and the boy was chafing her hands, and he says, somebody help me with this girl, she's dying. And he was just half crying, you know. And then, but I was thinking of my own child, of course, and I looked up, something drew my eyes upward, and in the second story of the building, part of it was standing, there was a girl pressed against the window. She just was pressed against it, and her eyes were asking me to get somebody to help her down. And I hope that my eyes were answering her, because I was thinking, I'll get somebody to get you down. And I went on, and I came to the front of the building, and when I did, there was just this pile of steel and mortar, everything, concrete, debris. It was a mess. And I thought my child was on the bottom of it, because I'd sent her to the grass underneath. And I thought, I have to lift every one of those girders. I have to get everything off of my child. I have to do it by myself. I thought I had to do it by myself. And then I found myself running in a circle, and I'd bend up and I'd straighten, and I'd bend up and straighten, bend over and straighten. And I was praying, and I was saying, oh God, don't take my child. Oh God, don't take my child. I was just saying it over and over.
Unlike too many mothers that day, Laureen found her daughter safely away from the danger. Carol Evans spent much of the day watching children die. A piece of concrete had trapped a girl in her chair.
And I hollered for somebody to bring me a jack. And immediately, somebody pulled a jack out of a car and got in there with me. We broke that chair down and got that little girl out. And it knocked one of her arms off. And I carried her out there to the gym, and her mother come out there and took her out of my arms. Then I went back around there, and I looked around, and man, that whole building was down, all the way around.
Outside the school, near chaos, mothers ran from their homes. Fathers raced across the oil fields. The why and how would have to wait. Right now, children were dying. Hope breeds strength, and frantic hands began to tear through what had been torn apart. With the turning over of each slab, a contradiction of emotion. Afraid they might find their child, terrified they might not. As word quickly left the schoolyard, the oil offices shut down so that the roughnecks and oil equipment could be brought in from the fields to aid the rescue. Chaos began to give way to order as the enormous scale of the task became evident. And just as evident, the town couldn't manage herself. Debris was scattered for a quarter mile, and death was everywhere. New London was crying for help. The call for help went out from New London. Doctors and nurses were needed, ambulances, emergency crews, a statewide plea from this small town in the oil patch. And soon those outside of New London began to realize whatever it was that had happened, it was something big and something awful. Now with the Dallas Times-Herald, Felix McKnight was working the Associated Press desk in Dallas that Thursday.
At about 3:45, we received a long-distance call from our correspondent in Henderson. And he was quite distraught, almost incoherent, and he was attempting to tell me that hundreds of children had been killed in an explosion at the New London Consolidated School. And frankly, I had not heard of New London, couldn't identify it immediately, and We talked back and forth for a minute or so, and about all he finally could give me were great sobs and good God, all of our children are dead, and we weren't certain at all of the details.
But the phone rang again, and this time it was Humble Oil in New London. They were asking for the use of the AP wires to put out a statewide alert. With the earlier incoherent call now deciphered, McKnight and the rest of the press began to descend on the disaster. For McKnight, the drive was a quick one with a DPS escort to New London. He arrived at dusk, the first wire reporter on the scene.
Well, I recall a scene I'll never forget, and I've seen it 1,000 times in nightmares. They were using peach baskets, and they were literally trying to tear that building down by hand. And they would dislodge bricks and rubble and cement and mortar and fill these peach baskets, and they'd formed a human line. I'd say about 50 men in each line, and they'd just pass the baskets down the line and start digging again.
As martial law was ordered, McKnight's notes would have to wait. He was drafted into the grim rescue, no longer reporting it, now a part of it. United Press International from Dallas arrived on the scene at nightfall, and one of their reporters was a young 22-year-old named Walter Cronkite.
It was the first disaster of any kind like that I'd seen, and is still to this day the biggest natural disaster of that sort I've ever covered. They were bringing in great searchlights from the oil fields. These lights were playing upon this pile of rubble. Couldn't even recognize it as a building. There was nothing left of it. There were no walls. There was something that looked a little like a roof, but it was on the ground. It had just collapsed on the 3 floors and gone.
By Cronkite's arrival, the crude, desperate rescue effort was well underway. There were no bulldozers. It was the strength of flesh and faith against steel and time.
These ant-like people on this pile of rubble. As we got closer and were able to park the car and get out and get up to the scene, we realized that these tough oil field workers were tear-stained faces, and their hands were bleeding with having torn away at these jagged edges of stone and brick, and they were carrying bodies out every minute or two.
The early death estimates varied wildly, but it was clear it was more bodies, dead or alive, than this town could handle. 20 miles to the west in Tyler, the largest, most modern hospital in East Texas, was ready for a festive grand opening. But Mother Frances Hospital would be pressed into service a day early, an opening not christened with champagne, but baptized in the blood of New London. Back at the scene, the rescue continued. The hopes of finding signs of life were deteriorating into a grisly death watch, and 298 times the worst fears were realized. But it would be days before a true death count would come. Many bodies were dismembered or simply blasted beyond recognition. It resembled more the carnage of a battlefield, but the young bodies were too young for war. Another of the young reporters on the scene was Tyler native Sarah McClendon.
I remember definitely seeing the bones of a girl child who was killed, and they were just like they'd been boiled for hours on the stove. Nobody could identify this girl. I always think of it every year at that time, and I realized how much it must have been like war bombing. It must have been it was equal to war.
Bodies were under sheets. 3 to 6 people under one sheet, bodies. I won't try to describe what I saw, but I became sick. I became nauseated.
The work went on throughout the night, digging by the beams of floodlights. Rain began to fall, making the work even harder, but perhaps the only way this day could end.
That night there was a storm. Oh, a